Hello, welcome. Welcome to It Depends. I am the solutions architect for Atmosoft. My name is Bill Moore. I'll be talking today. I want to go over and kind of discuss the kind of a basic developer concept of debugging and what it is and why we do it and some of the terms and everything that you'll see in relation to that. So debugging, first of all, is like one of my favorite activities to do in development. I love stepping through the code, looking at the state of the system, seeing how the system changes with different inputs, and then obviously tracking down bugs, which is the kind of the main function of debugging. Something isn't working exactly the way you expect, and so you go in and kind of get a look at the internals and figure out what's going on with the code. Usually it's going to be a logic error. Sometimes it can be a framework error. Sometimes it can be a hosting environment error. So there's lots of kind of challenges in debugging. And so I thought I would go over a couple of the basic concepts around debugging, or some concepts that you will run into when you're debugging. So, so first of all, debugging is you're obviously working with the debugger. That's usually whatever environment that you're, or not environment, whatever IDE that you're working with will most likely support debugging. There are a variety of options. There's Visual Studio Code, there's Visual Studio. Both have built-in debuggers. There's inline debuggers, or not inline, command line debuggers that you can use to kind of step through the execution of your code. What the debugger's primary job is to basically, when computers are executing instructions, they do it very fast, hopefully. And when what a debugger does is kind of execute your code line by line, and then lets you look at various items. Like you can look at local variables and their values in your function. You can look at you can step into and out of methods. You have breakpoints. So let's just say I have a long running application and I want to debug after the form is filled out and they push the submit button, right? I can put a breakpoint in the event for the click event, and I can debug that. There's some more complicated debug scenarios, which we can talk about later, that kind of involve the browser. A lot of applications that we develop now are web-based, and so the browser and the debugging tools in the browser are very, very good things to use and be familiar with. So a lot of times when I'm debugging a web application, I will use two debuggers. I will use Visual Studio and I will use the debugger built into Chrome. Chrome is my preferred browser. I like it, use it a lot. I like their developer tools, and the browser itself is fairly fast. So that's kind of my browser of choice, despite some of the tracking downsides. I am a big fan of Chrome. So that is kind of the IDE that I used to do when I need to do web debugging. So some of the concepts as we get into debugging, number one are breakpoints, and a breakpoint is essentially you highlight a section of your code, you set a breakpoint, and then that tells the IDE that when you hit this line of code, stop processing, and then basically let the human interact with us from there and kind of drive the execution of the program. So you set a breakpoint of like a click event of a button, and the compiler, or actually the IDE, the compiler, will stop at that breakpoint, and then you can continue debugging from there. Usually your options are step into, step over, step into, step over, step out. And these just kind of let you control where you want to go. So let's just say I put the breakpoint in the click event for a button, right? I have a breakpoint in there. The debugger stops. Then I can continue moving down the code, and I can stay in that method by stepping over methods that would take me kind of down the stack. Well, I'll talk about what a stack is here in just a second. Well, one of the things, so I can stay in the method and just be there, or I can completely follow the code logic all the way down as far as I want to go in order to get to a point where I can isolate the issue and kind of see what's going on. Some other terms that you need to be familiar with: a call stack. This is important. Okay, so If I set a breakpoint in the button click event handler and we stop executing, there's something that we can look at called a call stack. And that will tell you all the methods that were called to get you to the point in the program that you are now. And this is important for you to understand the context. Sometimes you'll be debugging and you'll see um, you'll get to a point in your code and you really want to understand the context of how that code function was called. There's been numerous times where I've gone in and then I look at the call stack and I'm like, oh, I did not expect the code to be flowing down this route. So there you have a logic issue, right? Like I didn't expect to look at the call stack and see, maybe I had a recursive function or something and I'm in there and it's just there the call stack is huge, right? I wasn't expecting to see something like that, or it was an unexpected code path, module A called module B called module C, and then C called D, and you expected the code path to be, module A to B to D, right? You didn't expect to be going through C, but somehow your code, the way it was executed, kind of draws to. So that's an important concept to understand. So your call stack is important to help you understand where you are in your code execution. And then we have our in Visual Studio, it's called an immediate window, and uh, and then we can also see all of the variables, including global variables, and we can see their current values. A lot of the current debuggers will kind of give you like color coding, so you can quickly see when values are changing. You can set conditional breakpoints, which allows you to break when certain conditions are met. Say like you're looping and you want to break when that the problem is happening when the index gets above 250, and you want to break after 250. You can use something called a conditional breakpoint. So um so as we're working through kind of debugging, we can see that where we are again in the code execution stack, and knowing where you are is important because you want to validate that the code followed the path that you were expecting the code to follow to get to where you are in your debugging session. So with debugging, again, we're using an IDE that has a built-in debugger, and we're stepping through the code. That's kind of the basics around debugging. Then let's just talk about a little bit of why, or basically let's talk about when we're going to debug. Okay, so for example, today I was debugging an issue I developed for one of our clients. I developed. They had some code that is being run in the organization, and prior to us getting there, the code had been lost, and so we don't have the original source code. So the application they're using to do this certain processing doesn't support some of the newer items that they needed to support. So I called it a repair tool. And what that repair tool does is it basically goes in and fixes records. So there is in the original code that we decompiled to figure out what was going on. If anyone's interested, we can have a conversation on decompiled output and kind of reading through and stepping through that and trying to figure out what a program is doing is a little more difficult than just looking at your source code. So we had this issue, and so what would happen is there was a default value that was being assigned. If a certain item in the code didn't match, then it would just say, oh, defaulted to this type of, we're working with warranties, defaulted to this type of warranty. And so what you would get is you would get this warranty, and it would be pasted in front of another warranty that wasn't supported and a number. And so what the repair tool does it does is it goes in and then figures out what the warranty is actually supposed to be. And so when in what I was debugging today was uh when the code ran, it wasn't fixing some of the warranties, and turns out that there were some new warranties that were added that my application didn't support yet. So I went in and debugged and kind of figured out, looked at the code, and now I was just trying to figure out why these weren't getting picked up, because I thought they'd already been, I'd already coded for them, but they appear to be new ones. And so that whole debugging process was trying to figure out the repair tool didn't fix these particular warranty types. So that's kind of where the conversation came down. And debugging is kind of a critical skill for a developer. So there's also different ways to debug, right? So I can debug locally in my development environment, but a lot of times we need to understand what's going on in production. So there is, I have done this in the past, don't recommend it, but there is ways to debug your actual production app while it's running with a debugger that's installed on the server or wherever your application is running. And you can kind of that if you're doing that, you're really kind of having possibly a very environment specific problem going on, and you really need to find out what's happening in the code when you're running in production, because maybe it's not happening in tests, maybe it's not happening in development. You're not able to replicate this issue, and it's a serious issue, and so you're going to debug production, which again, something that most people aren't doing this, and I haven't done it in a while. Typically, what we do in production now, the type of debugging we do here is logs, and then database tables where we're doing logging, log files themselves. I often, if I have an unknown problem crop up on a server that I'm not able to replicate, I'll even go as far as like looking in the event viewer. .NET's pretty good about writing down exceptions into the event viewer, and that can give you a little bit more a little bit more visibility into where the problem may be occurring. Because again, sometimes it's an environment specific problem and it's something you need to handle, but you don't necessarily have the capabilities to reproduce that particular problem. So that's kind of like talking about like debugging in production. You can use a debugger in production. However, I think I don't think we do that often very much anymore. And so if I have a production problem and I'm trying to figure out what's going on, the steps that I take are to try to collect as much information as I can via log files, event viewer, any database tables that I'm logging to, and I'll try to go back through and replicate that session, and then walk down the stack and see, okay, I was expecting that I'm importing this one particular file. That file is not actually being importing. I'm not actually getting an error, but it's just not doing any work. So I need to try to figure out what's going on. So the app's not crashing, but it's just not processing the files. Particularly latest one I had was there was a problem in one of the JSON files in one of the properties. Somebody forgot to put kind of a tick mark around there, and so when it was trying to read through and parse through the JSON, we were getting an exception saying that the JSON was invalid, and it wasn't erroring out, it just wasn't doing anything. So this is one of those issues where I kind of had to go back in. I got that particular set of information from the event viewer that we weren't parsing it correctly, and bam, fixed it, and then we were kind of good to go. But production debugging is going to be obviously slightly different than the debugging you do in development. It's one of the critical importance of logging. I really like to. I would rather have. I know some people would probably argue with me on this, but I would rather have too much information in my log file than not enough. Another thing that you can do is if you're having a problem that's specific to production as far as debugging goes, is you can add and do a deployment which adds additional logging. Like you don't have to leave that logging in, or you can change your log level, right? A lot of the loggers will have log levels. Like I want to log all of the info. I want to log just errors. I want to log just warnings. And you can kind of pick that. And then you can adjust that in the config file on the fly, which is really nice. So assuming you're not seeing information where the problem is happening in the report, any issues that you're seeing as far as the log level goes, and then as soon as you resolve your issue, you can turn the log levels back down so you're not logging as much information, taking up so much disk space, writing additional information to the database. Because I mean those things, and so you don't want to be over logging when you're not using it, but you also want that logging information to be available when you are. So those are some basic tips around the kind of like what is debugging, why do we do it, and some kind of some tips on debugging in production. I highly advise you to have a good logging strategy in production that allows you to kind of trace the application to the point where you need to in order to resolve any issues that are production specific, and then be able to back off the detailed logging when you can, and you can do that with the log level. And so production debugging is a little bit harder, but it's more about trying to find like a piece of information of where your application went wrong. And if you look hard enough, your application is going to be making a is going to be saying something somewhere, right? And so you can be like, oh, the JSON file is incorrect. Okay, so let's go fix the JSON file. Or it wasn't able to read the web config. Or so sometimes production debugging can be a little bit frustrating, but there are tools and stuff around that. So that's all. I just wanted to do a quick podcast on debugging and kind of go over some terms and kind of talk about what it is, why we do it, and then some tips and tricks on debugging in production. So I hope everyone has a great day. I hope you're having fun coding, and we will see you tomorrow.